All right, welcome for Engage and Adapt. We will be starting soon. As more people start to come in, let's introduce ourselves into the chat. But we have a lot of time for folks to come in, so we're going to be waiting here for a few minutes. All right, once again, we're going to get started here in about 5 minutes. Please feel free to come in, introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And yeah, please make sure to take care of all your needs. Anything you may need throughout the presentation, please do not hesitate to, if you need to take a pause, get some water, whatever the case may be. All right, we have Mary coming in from Vermont. Thank you for joining us, Mary. David coming in from Lancaster, Massachusetts. Julie coming in from Sterling, Virginia. Appreciate everyone taking the time. We're just going to take a few more minutes to get started here. All right, another David from Spotsylvania. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Jody from San Clemente. Thank you for joining us. Ed from St. Charles, I'm imagining, out of Missouri. Thank you, thank you, thank you. While we're here, we have a few minutes. If folks will want to talk about some things that they want to make sure to learn or some things we could discuss, feel free to drop that in the chat as well. But I am looking forward to the conversation. Lois down in Tampa from First United UCC. Thank you for joining us, Lois. I was lucky enough to spend some time in the Tampa area in the past. I always enjoyed myself. Normally we have some music here, but I'm not entirely sure what I could play without getting spiked by YouTube. Tom down in Harrisonburg. Thanks for joining us, Tom. Once again, hopefully everybody's comfortable, able to take care of their needs. We're going to talk here for just a few around what's happening after the ruling in Calais versus Louisiana, and some of the ways in which we can start to fight back. Oh, that sounds great, Julie. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. So, for this edition of Engage and Adapt, I'm going to be on my own. So I'm going to check the chat some every once in a while just to make sure we are capturing everyone's participation. But please feel free to type in there so that I can get the feedback and get some of the answers that you all may be looking at for as well. So once again, if you're just joining us, please tell us what your name, where you're from, and throughout the webinar, please take the time to do whatever you need in order to take care of yourself. This is an Engage and Adapt webinar series. This started last year. And what we really want to do is make sure that we have a space where we're practicing the ways in which we can lift up our voices in advocacy and our hands in help as people are being directly affected. Your moderator for today is myself, Chad Stanton. I'm the political director here at Sojourners and SojoAction. I'm originally from Dallas. I've been in DC for a while now, since 2015, and I've worked in a variety of roles. And I'm really excited to talk to you all today around what's happening and how we can make sure to fight back. So, just to level set, we're going to discuss the recent ruling by the Supreme Court and the state redistricting which is followed. We want to make sure we discuss how we can engage with decision makers on our behalf. And we also want to discuss the ways we can help people in our communities adapt. And once we finish with that, we'll have some time for group feedback. So for folks who may not be aware, the ruling in Louisiana versus Callais by the Supreme Court recently invalidated or interpreted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in a way in which racial gerrymandering was outlawed and racial gerrymandering in the service of black representation was outlawed, and partisan gerrymandering was allowed. So this functionally nullifies Section 2 of the VRA in a way in which racial gerrymandering can run rampant. The immediate reaction was states in the South looking to pass new maps eliminating districts with black lawmakers. Beyond the federal level, and so that's the immediate reaction. And we're also looking at states such as Georgia, who are going to be looking to redistrict once once the midterms pass. But down the line, we're going to have to consider the ways in which cities and states are also going to be affected by this ruling. In place, state legislatures as well as city councils and county governing bodies will also be affected by this ruling, as they were subject to some of the same protections for representation in governance. But we know that we can engage with decision makers to help shape what this process may look like, and kind of beat and hopefully beat back some of the changes that we're seeing be rushed through in the moment. So right now, in lifting our voices, we want to make sure that we're being clear that the right to representation was one of the hardest won and most impactful legacies of the civil rights movement. From the time of Reconstruction until today, has been understood that the best protection against treating people unequally is guaranteeing that they have the power to at least partially determine the conditions in which they live. We want to in quoting Psalms 82, chapter 82, verses 3 and 4, we want to make sure we defend the weak and fathers, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the wicked and the needy, and deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So these words, in my opinion, demonstrate a clear obligation to use our voices to defend those who are in need. And in this current moment, with black representation being attacked, I think there's a clear call to duty here. So, really quickly, as we begin our journey together, I want to ask a few questions, and you can answer in the chat room. What does engaging mean to you? What does it look like when you're engaging? And what are some of the things you notice when people are engaging with you? Jim, Rick, and Michelle also want to thank you for joining us. Just want to make sure to take a few engaging, taking the time to listen, reflect, and respond. That's a great answer, Lois. Thank you. Part of engagement is showing up. Thank you, Rick. So these are some great answers. And I wanted to make sure to move into what we're thinking about when we're thinking about engaging. We want to make sure to tell our elected leaders and community leaders how we feel. We want to make sure that our voices and our stories are important parts of the way people understand what's happening around them. And when we engage our community leaders, we want to make sure that they value the connection we have with the people who listen to us. And we want to make sure it's essential that we're thoughtful about how we use the trust that is given to us as community leaders. When thinking about how we can engage, we have to understand that, you know, church leaders, Christians, religious leaders of all stripes are especially trusted communicators, and we want to make sure that we're giving people the opportunity to use their voice, that power in a way that can really affect change in a way that is very unique. So, when thinking about reaching out, we want to keep in mind that despite the speed with which some Southern legislators move to try and change maps, we can still demand full representation for everyone. We can still call, email offices and ask to speak with them or a member of the staff. We want to also keep in mind that a lot of offices are utilizing things like Zoom and other remote options in order to make sure that as many community members as they can meet are being met. And then we want to share where we live and what issues we like to discuss when contacting offices. These are some of the ways in which we can make sure that when we're talking to, if we're reaching out to a state legislator or even a federal one, that we get a reception. So here's a good example. My name is Chad. I like to schedule some time with a member or someone on the staff to discuss the recent changes to voting districts and how they may affect our community. So you want to make sure you're using our language. You want to make sure that you are being very clear around the things that you want to discuss, so that the staff can understand who exactly they can have addressed some of your concerns. And you want to make sure you're being clear there, so that the office in general can have a good understanding and engage of how many people are concerned about these changes. Once they respond, you want to make sure to thank them and prepare for the conversation. And we want to make sure we're using reliable information when we're talking to folks, and especially particularly when we're in legislative offices or doing anything public facing. And then we want to make sure we're emphasizing our moral commitment to helping people. Um, Part of why we want to make sure to emphasize the moral dimension of our advocacy is quite often legislative offices are bombarded with a lot of facts, figures, and sometimes legal arguments to explain people's particular positions. But quite often, what's missing is that moral dimension, which I think, again, as religious leaders, we can bring a unique value add to. As faith leaders, our moral call demand that everyone should be that everyone is given an opportunity for political representation. The changes to these protections for representation will make our country less democratic at the city, state, and national levels. So we want to make sure we're calling on leaders to protect representation and true democracy for everyone. Um, it is important that we are able to articulate why, in particular, that political representation is congruent and particularly demanded by our particular faith tradition, and our moral sense of right. Everyone's right to dignity is embodied in political representation. We can't say that everyone has the same rights, humanity, needs when we will not allow them to speak for themselves when it comes to what their political needs may be. And so if we want to make sure everyone has the resources they need, we need to require that everyone has the representation that they need in order to demand those resources or voice that need. I want to stop there. I understand I talk a little fast sometimes, and ask if there's like any questions, comments, anything to add there. Want to lift up what Mary said there in the chat. When engaging, discouragement decreases. This is very true. We want to make sure we're empowering people to take action in a way that continues to build their agency and continues to build their power. And so, taking the time to engage and show that there is movement really does help to convey that for folks. Going to pause just a little longer to see if there's anything else folks may want to add or any questions about what I may have shared so far. All right, if not, moving on. So one of the things we want to make sure to keep it, oh, there's something in the chat. How can people not as directly affected by some recent rulings? I'm guessing, Rick, that the rest of the question is engage, and I will make sure to add there. Now, I'll come back to that and answer that question. Court decision engage. Yep. No, I got you. And I'll definitely make sure to come to circle back there. All right. And so your particular context, one of the best aspects of your involvement is letting people back home understand that people care about these issues, right? So if you're not kind of speaking to Rick's questions, if you're not in one of the states that's most directly affected at this moment in time, we want to make sure that we are voicing our concern across the board. We don't want to leave people isolated when it comes time to advocate for themselves, right? So even if you're in New Hampshire or Vermont or Arizona, wherever the case may be, by being willing to speak out, use your voice, do things like write op-eds, talk to your congressperson, you are contributing to the general understanding that these things are happening for your neighbors, for people who may be in positions of responsibility, who may not understand exactly what is going on. And so you're going to be informing people in order to take action, and you're also building a consensus, which really allows political actors to take action in a way or emboldens political actors to take action. And so some of that local context where people aren't going to expect to see an argument around voting rights in the South can be really useful in kind of pushing people towards action, also pushing people towards a particular consciousness, but also helping to warn them for things that they may need to look out for in the future in their communities. And so, with that in mind, some of the things that concern you in your community can be a part of your argument. Later on in the webinar, I will discuss the ways and discuss some of the ways this ruling will not only affect federal voting districts in the South, but also state legislative districts, city council districts, county council districts, and things of that nature, which also affect the people's ability to have representation. Some things you may also want to think about, how can you connect with the people you meet at home, and who else do people listen to where you live, and would it be useful to engage them there? So those are some questions around the particular context. Ed, see you switching to your laptop, no problem. Excuse me. So when you're talking to decision makers, when you're making public statements, you want to think about some of the things about where you're from that are unique. What are some of the things that make your community special? What are some of the concerns you have about your community? And where do you see yourself in the larger network of your community? By considering these questions, you can tailor your message in a way that truly resonates with the people who are around you. You want to make sure that you're speaking the language of those that are listening. And so being very cognizant and connected with your community and being able to articulate the problems at the national level and how they may trickle down to the local level is very important in order to get people invested in the work that you're doing and the issue that you would like to have addressed. And in this case, make sure everyone has full political representation. Does that make sense for folks? Awesome. Seeing some yeses in the chat. Thank you, Lois. Getting a little technology. All right. So here are some resources we can use for our research and our engagement. So sources like the Brennan Center are very reliable sources when it comes to voting rights. There are the NAACP, the Urban Institute are also really good resources. And there are coalitions that are currently acting. in that are also really good there. We also want to make sure we're utilizing information or news sources that have earned trust in our communities. So if, there's a story in the local paper which mentions some of the changes, or a story in the local paper which mentions some of the potential changes, being able to cite that will give you a lot of credibility when you're talking to people, particularly decision makers in that community, other civic leaders, other community leaders. So, if the mayor is opposed to it, and you know that the person at the federal level may not, and vice versa. And with community leaders, we're thinking about people who lead churches or who are leaders in church communities. But we're also thinking about people who are leaders within different groups that are organizing around this as well. So, what's happening? A little bit more there. Federal gerrymandering. With the recent rush to eliminate districts with black representatives, we are harming our ability to care for everyone. Partisan gerrymandering is racial gerrymandering and harms our ability to stop further discrimination. And these changes will reverse our progress towards full democracy. These are some of the messages that I think are going to be particularly impactful when we're trying to argue for um, why these things are wrong. I do want to stop there and ask if there are any other arguments that folks may have when thinking about uh, why this is a getting rid of the VRA is a bad idea. And no worries, Cheryl. This is also being recorded and will be added to YouTube later, so we'll be able to share this with folks who may be able to use it later. Yep, Linda. DC does not have representation in the Senate. And the federal government is overruling DC laws. I think this is an excellent example of the way the lack of representation leads to further discrimination. We've seen DC, the District of Columbia, occupied by the National Guard. They are changing laws which were passed in order to kind of protect people within the city, without any regard for the safety of the community. And it's an excellent example of the way when you take away people's full right to representation, you're kind of leaving them exposed to the whims of others, which is you know uh, leaving a situation ripe for abuse. Thank you for mentioning that. I really I really do appreciate it. Um, all right, beyond federal maps, this ruling will make it harder for people at the state level to build power as well. Things like city and countywide districting in local government and state level gerrymandering will lock entire neighborhoods, communities out of the ability to determine the needs and wants of their community. So we want to make sure we're hearing everyone's voices if we want to make sure if we want to make sure that we're caring for everyone as well. I think these are once again are like really powerful arguments for why we need the full right to representation for everyone. Yep, that's exactly right, Julie. So Julie in the chat says, it's not just the right to vote, it's the right to actually be represented by someone who understands our needs. Rick asks on the trickle down the state and local level. Yes. So um, before the VRA, a lot of municipalities and counties had um, election processes in which they did not have districts for particular parts of their community. So um, you would have a county council that was elected fully, every county council member being elected countywide, or every city council member being elected citywide. This was done in order to make sure to dilute the black vote at that moment in time, so that a black candidate wouldn't be viable within those municipalities or voting districts. Um, this was a big way in which segregation was able to kind of maintain itself because there was no one there to kind of challenge some of the segregationist policies within these, cities, counties, and municipalities that, again, kind of trickle up towards state level racist policy and then federal level racist policy. And so when we're thinking about the VRA, there is a rightfully great focus on what's happening at the federal level, but without that right to protection at the local and state level as well, you're going to see a drop in representation, which will also lead to a drop in participation, but most importantly, a drop in the ways in which people can address the needs of their communities. Yep. And so in Tampa Bay, Florida's House seats are given to Republicans from outside the county. Yes, this is how that gerrymandering works. Great participation in the chat here. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward for the folks who may be on YouTube. And so what do we want to say? We want to express our concern with the new changes to how we practice democracy. We want to make sure we stay engaged as these policies are implemented to minimize the harm as much as possible. So we want to make sure there is a cost for, state legislators, city councils, federal legislators who are pushing for an end to full representation. And we want to make sure to stay engaged and open to discussing the community issues that are important to us and understand what's important to them. So this is one of those things where we are engaging with decision makers. We do want to continue the conversation in a way if we possibly can. So, you know, when we have our own concerns and we express them, we want to make sure we're listening when they say, well, we are also concerned about X, Y, and Z, so that we can try and find a solution there. Sometimes we can say, oh, we have heard that before. Here's an answer to that problem. And if we're able to do that, then we can kind of push the ball forward in convincing officers that they have the political room and narrative room to change these policies. So how can we say it best? This is a bit of what I'm talking about here is, and we want to thank them for the time and any stances or policy decisions that are important to us, uh, which we agree with. So you don't want to, come in and say like, even though I know you are against full representation, I want to thank you for being honest or anything of that nature. But you do want to, if they've said, if they've added money to the budget on a policy that we agree with, then we can break the ice by making sure to show them that we're paying attention and we appreciate what they've done, and we just like them to do a little bit more. We want to start from a space of shared values. We want to make sure we're speaking in a language that allows them to come across to the right side when we're in the meeting with them. We want to lead with what we know and be confident in our place. So if we say, hey, this is going to reduce representation in this way, and that's going to have these downstream effects, we want to make sure we're sure about that, but we also want to make sure that we're not being pushed off of that position. We want to listen actively for new information or possibilities. Are there any fixes that they're considering? Is there any upcoming decisions that you can add your input to? How do they see these changes being implemented and what are they concerned about? What are the alternatives they see to addressing these issues? All of the ways in which, is there going to be an independent commission? Is there probably a partisan commission? Who's going to be on the commission? Who else can we talk to? These type of questions can kind of lead you to or give you a chain to follow in order to kind of work your way up and try and influence as many people as possible. Um, so these are some of the questions we want to make sure to ask when we're engaging with folks. And again, I'll pause and ask what are some other questions folks may think about. Yeah, this is a great question. What is the best way to engage in front in a loving way? The power and control driven Christian nationalist movement, a misguided understanding of Christianity is undergirding many of these hurtful actions. That's a great question, David. And it's one that, if I had the magic solution, I'd definitely implement. But I think a good starting point is by working through some of the shared values around community, some of the shared values around dignity. Um, Honestly, some of the shared values that we probably hold around autonomy. I think people really would like to have the ability to determine what's best in their life, and really hope to work through some of the implications of the logic that is presented in Christian nationalism to kind of walk through why people would be opposed to it. That's not going to always work. Um, but I think right now that may be the best approach um, when we're in an advocacy space. Um, I think there's a lot to be said for taking a different approach when you're in different spaces. And when you're in, you know, a more persuasive space, I think trying to find the ways that some of their stated values conflict with some of their actions and really, hoping for some reflection there can be useful, while understanding the limits of that approach as well. And Julie says, point out some of the glaring and harmful downsides of the gerrymandering and ask for alternatives that have fewer harms. I think that's right. I think um, there may be a conversation around why people or certain offices feel as if they can't represent particular communities and people. But that may be a bit more of a fraught conversation. But I I'll leave that there. In Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 and 46 says, Linda, yeah. All right. So what do we do next? We want to make sure to report back our experiences through right now we have Mighty Networks, which is a really cool space, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, where folks who are engaging are coming together in order to kind of discuss their efforts from around the country and how they can be most effective. We want to make sure to follow up with a note of thanks. Just, it's common courtesy, and also, make sure that they kind of help to remember you. We want to make sure we monitor the news for any developments which could be useful to share. Moving directly throughout the Bible, we're met with examples of people taking direct action and intervening when they see or know something to be unjust. Is in Exodus chapter 15, verses 15 to 21. When Shipra and Puah intervened to stop the Pharaoh from killing all the male children in Israel. Moses' mother in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Miriam's witnesses her brother's rescue and have him nursed at home. Each of these actions are example of people moving directly to address harms. And we want to make sure that we're also taking action directly within our communities to protect the people who are directly affected, if we can. So addressing elected leaders who can make changes to the policies we need as much as we can. Um, we want to make sure we're also doing things that can help people who are directly affected. So a lot of churches already have things like programs like Souls to the Polls, um, and Know Your Rights programs, which help people understand, when, how, and the ways in which they can vote. We can also train people to serve as poll chaplains, poll work watchers, and election workers in order to kind of directly try and get involved in the electoral process, so that they can try and guarantee that everyone has a right to representation. Um, so I want to pause there. Are there any other ideas folks have around how we can help in this moment? If so, feel free to toss them in the chat. All right, challenges to representation. With these recent changes, we can also look forward to an intensifying effort to prevent people from accessing the ballot. We know that the enemies of democracy are going to be emboldened in this moment, as we see with the way the enthusiasm in which people rush to try and eliminate representatives that they did not like. We can partner with and counsel people through the process who may otherwise struggle to navigate in this moment. And we want to make sure as many people as possible are getting the help that we need. And so there are also partner programs as well, which are utilizing technology. and also like older methods to try and get folks who may be outside of the particular states in the South that are changing some of their voting rules, to kind of help them get all the information they need in order to try and get to the polls as well. So there are many avenues people can take in order to kind of help in this moment. Oh, this is wrong. But we do have poll chaplain trainings, and that we will make sure to share with you all moving forward. That we are working with our partners in order to implement and get as many people, many chaplains trained as possible. And you also do not have to be a chaplain in order to take the training and also help to protect people at the polls. You can also utilize resources from organizations like Issue One, which we'll also make sure to share after the webinar, which outline things like supporting election workers, stopping disinformation, standing with the election officials as they continue to come under attack as we get closer to the election season. So definitely want to stop here to ask, what are other ways we can help? No, of course, Rick, I always have to plug the poll chaplains. William, does Christian nationalism have anything to do with what Christ taught? It's a good question, but we will veer into the philosophical. So once again, Mighty Networks is a space for people who are working in their communities. We'll make sure to send out an invitation so that folks who want to get involved while also staying connected to folks around the country who are doing so have an opportunity to do so, support good candidates with your treasure and talent. I think that's right, Ed. Although we are 501(c)(3), so we are not endorsing any particular candidates or positions. Um, You want to think about what people are doing in your area, what you're doing in your community, and what you would like to see. Yeah, and Rick is a good example of someone who's not a clergy person, but was welcomed and trained to be a part of the Pole Chaplain program. Oh, this is it. All right. So this is my last slide. I do want to make sure to give a big um, shout out to the folks who came out this last weekend for all Roads Lead South demonstrations in places like Selma, in places like Memphis, in order to really protest against some of these changes. And they will continue to ask folks to engage. I also want to make sure that we are continuing to think about the ways in which we can engage it within our local communities as well. Um, that being said, I'll take some time for any questions folks may have, any suggestions, and then we can probably wrap here in a few minutes. If there aren't any, then we can go ahead and website for my networks. We'll send you a link following the meeting, so you can join directly for our particular Mighty network because there are many that are connected to different organizations, and we have our own faith and action leadership space. Any suggestions how to find out more and plug in the local efforts? Yes, we also have a toolkit and action kit that we're going to make sure to send out afterwards. But you can also look to organizations like Indivisible, organizations like, again, the All Roads Lead South Coalition, for different opportunities. And we'll also make sure to continue to present different opportunities in order to engage around voting rights in particular. We're going to continue to offer poll chaplain trainings, as well as ways to engage federal lawmakers and state lawmakers on this through an action alert that should be uh, drafted and, and published pretty soon here. Uh, Ed, here in Missouri, we lost the redistricting case, but are pushing to force the Secretary of State to place an initiative on the August state ballot. Yeah, and I do want to make sure to take the time to emphasize that despite the lack of federal protections, you can push for state protections in your state. And those have been effective, particularly with the state Supreme Courts, in making sure to uphold the right to representation for everyone. So there are multiple avenues we can use in order to make sure that we're affecting change, and I think that's really important to emphasize. So thank you, Ed. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I really do appreciate your time. And I'm looking forward to following up and working with you all as we continue to respond in this moment. And again, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join me and really show up in this moment. All right, everybody. Oh, I think I did it wrong.